They said my spreadsheets were incorruptible. For 9 years I had processed supply chain data for the 81st Cadian shock troops, and in that time I never filed a single discrepancy report because there were no discrepancies to file. Every lasgun cartridge was accounted for. Every nutrient ration matched its authorized recipient. Every casualty aligned perfectly with its deployment record. My supervisors praised my efficiency. The commissariat trusted my documentation without review. I believed the numbers captured the complete truth of war. But when I found Private Cade Merrick's final requisition form requesting an extra ration pack 3 days before his death, then discovered Sergeant Ryland Cross had submitted the identical request at the exact same timestamp, I began to see a pattern the Imperium had trained me never to recognize. What is the cost of loving another soul more than you fear losing it? My name is Alara Voss, former Grade 3 Munitorum logistician, serial designation 7743 Theta Voss, and I was complicit long before I became a witness. The Munitorum archive bay on Firebase Tertius maintained a constant temperature of 14 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to preserve parchment for centuries. Cold enough that my breath misted when I spoke the morning prayer to the God Emperor. The bay measured exactly 47 meters by 32 meters, with steel shelving units rising 6 meters to a vaulted ceiling where servo skulls drifted through the gloom, their red optical sensors sweeping for unauthorized access. My workstation occupied the northeast corner, position 7 of 12, and from that vantage I could observe the entire archive without turning my head. This was by design. The Munitorum valued spatial awareness in its logisticians. We were the memory of the Imperium, the keepers of the ledgers that proved every bullet fired, every soldier fed, every death recorded served the Emperor's will. My duties began each morning at the 6th hour precisely. I would input my authorization code into the cogitator terminal, a 12-digit sequence I had memorized within my first week of service, and wait for the machine spirit to verify my credentials. The terminal was old, a relic from before the current campaign cycle, and its processors wheezed and clicked as they authenticated my access. While I waited, I would recite the logistician's creed, the prayer we were taught in training. I record. By his wisdom I verify. By his judgment I account. Let no soul pass unmeasured. Let no resource vanish untracked. Let no death occur unlogged. For in the ledger is truth, and in truth is service. The words felt like armor. They organized my thoughts, aligned my purpose with something greater than myself. The work itself possessed a rhythm that bordered on meditative. Supply requisitions arrived via data slate from company commanders, and I would cross-reference each request against authorized quotas, current inventory levels, and projected consumption rates. A lasgun power pack lasted approximately 100 shots under standard combat conditions. A nutrient ration provided 2,000 calories. A frag grenade weighed 0.6 kilograms. These were constants in a galaxy of variables, fixed points around which I could structure meaning. When Sergeant Vallon requested 40 power packs for 2nd Platoon, I knew 2nd Platoon consisted of 37 effectives, which meant 40 packs would provide sufficient ammunition for a standard patrol with minimal surplus. Approved. When Lieutenant Harrow requisitioned 72 nutrient rations for a 3-day forward deployment with 18 soldiers, I calculated 18 soldiers consuming 2 rations daily for 3 days equaled 108 rations required, not 72. Denied, amended, resubmitted at correct quantity. The system worked because the numbers worked. And the numbers worked because people like me ensured they did. I took pride in this precision. Pride is perhaps the wrong word, too warm and personal for what I felt. Satisfaction, maybe. The contentment of a cogwheel that meshes perfectly with its neighboring gears, contributing to a mechanism larger and more important than itself. My personnel file contained 6 commendations for accuracy, 3 for efficiency, and 1 for exemplary devotion to duty in maintaining record integrity during the siege of Hadrian's Gate. I had never met the Munitorum colonel who signed that commendation, but I kept the certificate in my footlocker, wrapped in wax paper to protect it from the firebase's humidity. Sometimes I would take it out and read it before sleep, tracing my finger over the Aquila seal embossed in red wax at the bottom. This was proof that I mattered, that my work served something holy, The 81st Canadian Shock Troops had been garrisoned at Firebase Tertius for 11 months when I first noticed the pattern. 11 months of logging their requisitions, tracking their casualties, maintaining the vast web of data that kept a regiment of 4,000 souls functioning in a hostile war zone. I knew the regiment by its numbers before I knew it by its soldiers. I knew that Company B consumed 17% more ammunition than Company A despite having identical manpower, which suggested either more aggressive engagement protocols or less accurate marksmanship. I knew that 3rd Platoon had suffered 12 casualties in 9 months, while 5th Platoon had suffered 31, which indicated either superior tactical doctrine or significantly easier deployment assignments. I knew these things with certainty because I had processed every requisition, every casualty report, every deployment manifest. The regiment existed in my spreadsheets as a living organism made of numbers, and those numbers told me everything I needed to know about its health and efficiency. Private Cade Merrick's requisition appeared in my queue on a Tuesday morning, 4th week of the 9th month of garrison duty. The request was unremarkable in itself: 1 supplemental nutrient ration pack, authorized for soldiers conducting extended sentry duty beyond normal meal distribution hours. The justification code cited Nightwatch assignment, position Theta 12, duration 8 hours. Standard procedure. I verified his assignment against the duty roster, confirmed he was indeed scheduled for Nightwatch, and approved the requisition with a single keystroke. The transaction took perhaps 15 seconds of my attention before I moved to the next item in the queue. What made me pause, what planted the first seed of wrongness in my mind, was discovering an identical requisition form submitted by Sergeant Ryland Cross 3 entries later in the same queue. Same justification code, same position assignment, same timestamp, down to the minute. 2 soldiers requesting supplemental rations for the same sentry post at the same time. The logical explanation presented itself immediately: joint assignment, 2-person watch. Both soldiers authorized for extended duty rations, but the duty roster listed position Theta 12 as a single occupant post. Standard operating procedure mandated solo watches for perimeter positions to maximize coverage area. 2 soldiers sharing a post meant half the perimeter was being monitored. I flagged the discrepancy for review, as procedure required, and sent an inquiry to the duty officer requesting clarification on the assignment change. The response arrived within the hour. Position Theta 12 had been expanded to a 2-soldier post due to increased enemy activity in that sector. Adjustment authorized by company commander. The explanation was perfect, reasonable, complete. I updated my records to reflect the new manning requirement and closed the inquiry. The system had performed exactly as designed: anomaly detected, explanation requested, clarification provided, records corrected, faith in the process reinforced. But I remembered it. Something about those 2 names appearing together, requesting the same resource at the same moment, stayed with me in a way that other routine transactions did not. I began noticing them more frequently in my daily processing. Merrick and Cross. Their names appeared in proximity often enough that I started tracking the pattern without consciously deciding to do so. When Merrick requested resupply of his lasguns focusing crystal on the 14th day of the 10th month, Cross submitted an identical request the same day. When Cross volunteered for a hazardous reconnaissance patrol in week 3 of the 11th month, Merrick's name appeared on the same volunteer roster. When Merrick reported to the Medica with a sprained wrist, Cross escorted him there according to the medical log's witness signature. Professional curiosity, I told myself. A logistician's instinct to understand patterns in the data. Nothing more sinister than an interest in operational efficiency. Perhaps they were squad mates with synchronized equipment maintenance schedules. Perhaps they were friends who volunteered for assignments together. The kind of battlefield brotherhood the Commissars encouraged as beneficial to morale. I even felt a small warmth thinking about it, imagining 2 soldiers forging the bonds of loyalty that made the Imperial Guard effective. This was good. This was what the Emperor wanted from his soldiers: unity, mutual support, dedication to one another in service to him. I should have stopped noticing there. I should have filed the observation away as interesting but irrelevant to my duties, and returned my attention to the endless queue of requisitions requiring my approval. But the human mind, Even one trained in the cold mathematics of logistics seeks patterns with an intensity that borders on compulsion. And once you begin seeing a pattern, once you acknowledge its existence, you cannot unsee it. It pulls your attention like gravity, demanding investigation, demanding understanding. The archive bay contained records going back 7 years. The full history of the 81st Cadian's deployment to this sector. On a quiet morning in the 12th month, when my requisition queue was unusually light, I accessed the historical database and ran a search query. All requisitions submitted by Private Merrick and Sergeant Cross since their arrival at Firebase Tertius. The cogitator wheezed and processed, its machine spirit sorting through thousands of transactions. The results materialized on my screen in neat columns: dates, items, justifications, approval status. The correlation was statistically improbable. Out of 147 requisitions submitted by Merrick over 11 months, 73 had been submitted within 1 hour of an equivalent requisition from Cross. Out of 192 requisitions submitted by Cross, 91 had temporal proximity to Merrick's submissions. The items were often identical: nutrient rations, equipment replacements, ammunition resupply. Sometimes they were complementary. Merrick would request a replacement lasgun power pack, while Cross requested a replacement focusing lens. As though they were maintaining each other's equipment, the pattern extended beyond supplies into personnel records, volunteer rosters, medical visits, leave requests, always staggered so that one returned as the other departed, ensuring someone remained on duty. I stared at the data for 20 minutes, my morning prayer forgotten, my requisition queue ignored. The numbers were telling me something, but I could not translate their language into meaning. Or perhaps I would not. Perhaps I sensed that understanding would require me to acknowledge something the Imperium had no vocabulary for, no place for, no tolerance for. A servo skull drifted past my workstation, its optical sensor rotating toward my screen. I minimized the query results reflexively, irrationally worried that the machine spirit would report my research as inappropriate use of archive resources. The skull continued its patrol without pausing, and I breathed out slowly, my heart rate elevated for no logical reason. I was authorized to access this data. Historical research was part of my duties when optimizing supply chain efficiency. There was nothing wrong with what I had discovered, nothing actionable, nothing that contradicted any regulation or doctrine. So why did my hands shake when I closed the query and returned to my requisition queue? The answer came 3 weeks later, during inventory audit of Storage Bay 7. Quarterly audits were my responsibility, a duty I performed with the same methodical precision I applied to everything else. Storage Bay 7 housed personal effects of deceased soldiers awaiting transport to Munitorum Central for final disposition. The bay was smaller than the main archive, perhaps 15 meters by 10, with steel lockers lining 3 walls. Each locker contained the mundane debris of a life ended: identification tags, personal correspondence, small items deemed non-heretical by the commissariat. Everything valuable had already been reclaimed for redistribution. What remained was the stuff too personal for recycling, too worthless for salvage, but too human for immediate incineration. I was conducting item count verification, matching locker contents against manifests, when I reached locker 47. The manifest listed one occupant, Private Cade Merrick, deceased 3 weeks prior during orc assault on perimeter section Sigma. Cause of death: multiple trauma from greenskin choppa wounds. Body status: recovered and cremated. Personal effects: standard kit minus items requisitioned for redistribution. I opened the locker expecting the usual contents: dog tags, perhaps a few letters from family on distant worlds, maybe a prayer book or good luck charm. What I found instead was a small bundle wrapped in camouflage netting, tucked into the back corner behind Merrick's identification tags. Standard procedure required full inspection of all contents, so I removed the bundle and unwrapped it on the workbench beside the locker. Inside were 2 items. The first was a piece of shrapnel, perhaps 5 centimeters long, twisted and scorched from explosive impact. It had been carefully sanded smooth along one edge, the metal polished until it gleamed despite the poor lighting. The second item was a data slate, the cheap personal model soldiers could purchase from the regimental sutler for communication with family. I activated the slate, expecting to find letters, maybe recordings for loved ones. The device's memory contained only one file, a text document, 7 lines long, unsigned. When the darkness is complete, I will remember your name. When the enemy comes, I will stand between them and you. When the end arrives, I will not let you die alone. This is my promise. This is my only prayer. You are my light. You are the reason I survive each day. I read it 3 times. 4 times. The words did not change. The meaning did not become less clear. This was not battlefield brotherhood. This was not the sanctioned bonds of squad camaraderie the commissariat encouraged. This was something else entirely, something private and intense and absolutely forbidden by every regulation governing military conduct in the Astra Militarum. Attachment beyond professional loyalty was weakness. Personal bonds that prioritized individual soldiers over unit cohesion were corruption. Love, if that was even the correct term for what these words described, was antithetical to the Guard's function. Soldiers were numbers in a ledger. They were resources to be deployed, consumed, and replaced. They were not individuals with interior lives complex enough to contain this kind of devotion. The data slate felt heavy in my hand, heavier than its actual mass. I should report this. Procedure was explicit. Any evidence of conduct unbecoming Imperial Guard personnel must be filed with the commissariat immediately. The commissar would investigate, determine if this violated regulations, take appropriate action. This was not my decision to make. I was a logistician, not an arbiter of military discipline. My duty was clear. I wrapped the data slate back in the netting and returned it to the locker exactly where I had found it. I completed the inventory audit, verified the manifest accuracy, and submitted my report with no mention of the bundle or its contents. That night, lying in my bunk in the Grade 3 personnel barracks, I told myself I had simply forgotten to note a minor discrepancy in personal effects. An oversight, insignificant. The kind of small error even the best logisticians occasionally made. But I knew the truth. I had made a choice. And that choice meant something inside me had shifted, some foundational certainty cracked just wide enough to let doubt seep through. The numbers could lie after all, or at least hide truths they were never designed to measure. And if that was possible, what else had I failed to see in my 9 years of perfect ledgers and flawless spreadsheets? The second incident occurred 6 weeks after I returned the data slate to Merrick's locker. I was processing casualty reports from a recent engagement, a standard patrol ambush that had cost the 81st Cadian 4 dead and 7 wounded. The reports were routine names, ranks, causes of death, equipment lost or damaged, recommendations for replacement personnel. I had processed hundreds of such reports over my tenure. The dead became numbers in my spreadsheet, their names transferred from active duty rosters to casualty archives, their equipment redistributed to replacements. This was the rhythm of war, predictable and necessary. Sergeant Rellencrose's name appeared on the wounded list. Shrapnel damage to left arm and torso, prognosis positive, expected return to duty within 3 weeks. The medical officer's notes described the injury in clinical detail: 17 separate penetration wounds, 2 requiring surgical extraction, blood loss moderate but not critical. Treatment: immediate field medicine, surgical intervention at regimental aid station, antibiotics and pain management ongoing. The report was thorough, professional, unremarkable. What made me pause was the witness statement attached to the medical file, a requirement for all combat injuries to verify the circumstances and ensure appropriate decorations or disciplinary actions were considered. The witness was Private Heron Vale, 2nd Squad. His statement described how Sergeant Cross had been wounded while pulling a fallen soldier from the line of fire during the ambush. The enemy had maintained suppressing fire on their position, and Cross had exposed himself to retrieve the soldier rather than abandon him. The statement praised Cross's bravery and recommended consideration for commendation. The fallen soldier Cross had rescued was not named in Vale's statement. Standard procedure for witness reports did not require identifying individuals being aided unless relevant to potential disciplinary matters. But I knew who it must have been. The casualty report listed 4 dead from the engagement, and I cross-referenced their names against squad assignments. None belonged to 2nd Squad where Cross served. All 4 casualties came from 3rd Squad. But 3rd Squad had no wounded listed in the medical reports. Everyone from 3rd Squad was either dead or uninjured. Except the report was wrong. I checked the patrol manifest against the casualty list and found the discrepancy immediately. 3rd Squad had deployed with 8 soldiers. 4 were confirmed dead. 4 should have survived uninjured. But 3rd Squad's active roster now showed only 3 names. Someone was missing from both lists, present in neither the dead nor the survivors. I ran the search query manually, pulling up every file associated with the patrol. The deployment manifest listed Private Cade Merrick as part of 3rd Squad's complement. His name appeared on the initial roster, but the casualty report made no mention of him. Neither did the survivor list. He had simply vanished from the documentation somewhere between departure and return, a ghost in the numbers. The explanation came 2 days later when I received a corrected casualty report from the regimental clerk's office. Private Merrick had been killed during the ambush, the addendum stated. The initial report had omitted his name due to processing error. Cause of death: multiple lasgun wounds to chest and abdomen. Body status: recovered. The correction was filed properly, all the appropriate forms attached. Nothing that would raise concern during routine audit. Just an administrative mistake, quickly fixed. But I had seen the original medical report. I knew Sergeant Cross had pulled someone from the line of fire, someone who had been wounded but not killed, someone whose name was carefully excluded from the witness statement, someone who had become deceased only in the corrected paperwork, after the fact. The commissariat had been involved. That much was obvious from the signature authorization on the corrected report. Commissar Hendrick himself had approved the amended casualty determination. When a commissar personally authorized documentation changes, it meant the matter involved potential disciplinary concerns. It meant someone wanted the truth obscured behind proper procedure and correct forms. I sat at my workstation for an hour after discovering the correction, staring at my screen without processing anything in my queue. The servo skulls continued their patrol overhead. The archive base temperature remained a steady 14 degrees. The cogitator's machine spirit hummed and clicked its patient rhythm. Everything was normal. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. But underneath the surface of perfect records and flawless documentation, something else entirely was happening, something the numbers could hide but not quite erase. Merrick had been wounded. Cross had saved him, exposed himself to enemy fire to pull his companion from death. And then someone had decided that narrative was unacceptable, that the bond it implied was too dangerous to acknowledge. So Merrick became dead in the paperwork, his actual wounds transformed into fatal injuries through the alchemy of corrected reports and commissarial authorization. Maybe he had died later from his injuries, maybe the correction was technically accurate, or maybe he had survived but been relocated, reassigned, removed from the regiment to break whatever connection the commissariat had identified as problematic. I would never know the truth. The numbers told me only what they were instructed to tell, and I was finally beginning to understand that instruction could be manipulation as easily as illumination. That night I returned to Storage Bay 7. Merrick's locker remained in position 47, its manifest unchanged. I opened it with my authorization code and removed the bundle from where I had replaced it weeks earlier. The data slate inside still contained the same 7 lines, the same unsigned promise. I read them again in the storage bay's dim lighting, and this time the words felt different, heavier with meaning I could no longer deny. This was not corruption or weakness. This was not deviancy requiring correction. This was a human being choosing to value another human being's survival over their own. Choosing connection in a galaxy designed to prevent exactly that kind of bond. The Imperium would call it heresy. Commissar Hendrick had called it significant enough to alter official records, to transform a rescue into a casualty, to erase evidence of devotion that existed outside the permitted frameworks. But sitting there in the cold storage bay, holding a dead soldier's private confession, I could not make myself agree with that judgment. I could not force my heart to accept that this love, this desperate need to remember someone's name in the darkness, this promise to stand between them and death, was wrong. And in that moment of dissent, quiet and internal and invisible to everyone around me, my faith began to die. The pattern became impossible to ignore after that. Once I knew what to look for, once I understood the shape of this particular wrongness, I saw it everywhere in the regiment's records. Not just Merrick and Cross, though their story haunted me most intensely. Dozens of other soldiers whose requisition patterns showed the same suspicious correlation. Pairs of names that appeared together in medical logs, volunteer rosters, leave requests. Soldiers who maintained each other's equipment, who shared rations, who orchestrated their schedules to maximize contact while maintaining plausible deniability. And underneath those patterns, visible only to someone actively searching, the commissariat's corrections. Casualty reports amended to separate deaths that had occurred together, transfer orders that split up soldiers whose names appeared too frequently in proximity, disciplinary actions filed against individuals for unnamed violations of conduct, the charges vague enough to avoid documentation, but severe enough to warrant immediate removal from the regiment. The system was not blind to these bonds. It was actively, methodically hunting them, and I was maintaining the ledgers that enabled that hunt. I began keeping a separate file, encrypted and hidden in a rarely accessed sector of the cogitator's memory banks, a shadow ledger tracking what the official records concealed. I documented 37 probable cases over the next 4 months, 37 sets of soldiers whose data suggested connections beyond sanctioned military relationships. Of those 37 cases, 19 had been resolved through commissarial intervention. Resolved. Such a clinical word for what I suspected was happening. Soldiers separated, reassigned, or simply absent from subsequent rosters with no forwarding documentation. Bodies counted twice in casualty reports to obscure joint deaths. Wounds described as individual misfortunes when the medical timestamps showed simultaneous treatment. The more I documented, the more I understood the system's design. The Imperium did not forbid connection because individual relationships were inherently wrong. It forbade them because loyalty divided was loyalty diluted. A soldier who fought to protect a specific person fought less effectively for the abstract concepts of Emperor and Imperium. A soldier who feared losing someone particular feared death less than separation, which meant they would choose death over abandoning their companion, which meant tactical flexibility was compromised by emotional attachment. The bonds I was documenting made soldiers simultaneously more dangerous and less reliable. More willing to fight with suicidal fury to protect each other, but less willing to follow orders that would separate or endanger their chosen person. The logic was perfect, cold, and absolutely rational. The Imperium needed soldiers who were cogs in a vast machine, interchangeable and replaceable. It needed guardsmen who would die when ordered without hesitation, who would accept reassignment without protest, who would watch their comrades fall without losing combat effectiveness. Personal attachment undermined all of that, so the commissariat hunted it, and the Munitorum recorded the hunt's results, and together we maintained a military force millions strong, by ensuring none of those millions loved each other more than they loved the Emperor. I understood the reasoning. I even acknowledged its practical necessity, in some abstract philosophical sense. But I could not reconcile that understanding with what I had seen in Merrick's locker. With those 7 lines promising to remember someone's name in the darkness. I could not make myself believe that eradicating that kind of devotion made the Imperium stronger. It only made us more alone. The confrontation happened during a routine audit review. Commissar Hendrik visited the archive bay quarterly to verify proper documentation protocols were being maintained. These visits were ceremonial more than functional. A reminder that the commissariat's authority extended even into the realm of paperwork and ledgers. Hendrik would review a random sample of my files, ask cursory questions about procedure, and depart satisfied that the Munitorum standards were being upheld. I had passed 7 such audits without incident. The 8th audit occurred in the 3rd month of the new year, 6 months after I had found Merrick's data slate. Hendrik arrived precisely at the 10th hour. His uniform immaculate despite the firebase's dust and humidity, his augmetic left eye gleaming red in the archive bay's dim lighting. He was an older man, perhaps 60 Terran years, with the lean hardness of someone who had spent decades in combat zones. The commissar's authority was absolute in matters of discipline and morale, and his presence in my workspace made the air feel thinner, harder to breathe. He selected files randomly from my terminal, reviewing casualty reports and requisition approvals with practiced efficiency. His organic eye scanned the data, while his augmetic performed some internal analysis I could not perceive. For 20 minutes he worked in silence while I stood at attention beside my workstation, hands clasped behind my back, heart hammering against my ribs for no reason I could articulate. Then he stopped. His augmetic eye focused on a specific report, and I felt my stomach contract even before I knew which file he had found. It was the corrected casualty report for the patrol ambush, the one that had transformed Merrick from wounded to deceased, that had erased his rescue by Sergeant Cross, that had made a love story into a routine combat statistic. This correction was filed properly, Hendrik said. His voice was flat neutral, giving away nothing. No discrepancies in the documentation. Excellent work maintaining protocol during sensitive revisions. I said nothing. Agreement felt like complicity, but contradiction felt like suicide. Hendrik closed the file and turned to face me directly. His organic eye was gray, cold as the archive bay's preserved air. His augmetic whirred softly as it focused. You filed this correction without question or commentary. That demonstrates proper discretion in matters of regimental discipline. Yes, sir. The words came automatically. You understand why such corrections are necessary, Logistician Voss. I hesitated. The question felt weighted, dangerous, like choosing between landmines. To ensure accuracy in official records, sir. Accuracy. Hendrik repeated the word slowly, as though tasting it. An interesting interpretation. Would you like to know the actual reason? This was not a question I could safely answer. I remained silent. Hendrik continued without waiting for response. Private Merrick was not killed by enemy fire during that ambush. He survived his wounds. He was executed 16 hours later for conduct violations that cannot be documented in detail without compromising operational security. The corrected casualty report attributes his death to combat action, because that narrative serves the regiment's morale more effectively than the truth. Do you understand? My throat was too dry for speech. I nodded. Sergeant Cross was offered a choice, Hendrik said, his voice still neutral, still cold. He could accept Merrick's combat death and continue his service with the 81st Cadian, or he could contest the finding and face charges of the same conduct violations. He chose the former. He chose to live and carry that choice forward. This is what survival requires in the Imperial Guard, logistician, the ability to accept necessary losses and continue functioning. Yes, sir. Hendrik closed the terminal and stepped back from my workstation. His augmetic eye rotated through some calibration sequence, light flickering across my face. You have maintained excellent records during your tenure here, Voss. The regiment depends on logisticians who understand that some truths serve no purpose, that some patterns are better left unacknowledged, that some data points should remain anonymous even when they correlate. He knew. He knew I had been tracking the patterns, documenting the bonds, keeping my shadow ledger. The statement was a warning wrapped in professional courtesy, an offer to let me continue as long as I stopped looking, stopped remembering, stopped caring about the names behind the numbers. I said. The lie tasted like ash. Hendrik nodded once and departed without another word. The servo skulls tracked his exit, their optical sensors lingering on his uniform before resuming their patrol pattern. I stood beside my workstation for 10 minutes after he left, breathing carefully, trying to process what I had just learned. Merrick had been executed. Not killed in combat, but executed for the crime of loving someone more than he feared losing them. And Cross lived on, carrying that loss, accepting the lie, continuing to serve the regiment that had murdered the person he had written those 7 lines for. The system had identified their bond, evaluated its threat to unit cohesion, and eliminated it with the same efficient brutality it applied to orc incursions and heretic rebellions. There was no malice in it, only cold calculation, only the math of survival in a galaxy where attachment was weakness and love was heresy. I accessed my shadow ledger that night and deleted it completely, purging every file, every correlation, every documented instance of soldiers caring for each other beyond sanctioned limits. I deleted it because Commissar Hendrik had given me the chance to comply, and refusing that chance meant becoming the next casualty report requiring correction. But I could not delete the memory of those patterns. I could not unsee what I had seen, unknow what I now understood about the system I served. The Imperium did not forbid love because love was wrong. It forbade love because love made you human, and humanity was inefficient in a machine that required its components to be replaceable. Sergeant Rylan Cross died 11 months after Merrick's execution, during a massed orc assault on Firebase Tertius's eastern perimeter. The casualty report described his death as heroic. He had held position Sigma 7 alone for 40 minutes after his squad was killed, maintaining covering fire that allowed 3rd Company to establish a defensive line. Posthumous commendation for valor recommended. Body recovered and cremated according to standard protocol. I processed his casualty report like I had processed thousands before it. Name, rank, cause of death, equipment lost, replacement requisition filed. The numbers were perfect. The documentation flawless. Nothing in the official record suggested anything except a soldier dying while in service to the Emperor. But I had maintained Cross's personnel file for nearly 2 years. I knew his requisition patterns, his volunteer history, his medical records, and I knew that position Sigma 7 had been the sentry post where he and Merrick had first requested joint watch duty, where their names had appeared together in my queue so long ago that discovering their pattern felt like ancient history now. Cross had not been assigned to position Sigma 7 during the assault. His squad was stationed 300 meters south at position Row 3. The duty roster was explicit. But when the orcs attacked, when the screaming green tide crashed against the Firebase's defenses, Cross had abandoned his assigned position and moved to Sigma 7. He had held the post alone because holding it alone meant fighting where Merrick had fought, dying where Merrick should have been standing beside him. The after-action report made no mention of this deviation from assigned position. Neither did the commendation recommendation. The official narrative praised his initiative and courage, his willingness to reinforce a critical position without waiting for orders. Clean story, inspiring message, perfect morale enhancement. I understood the real story. Cross had chosen his death. Not suicide exactly, but something close. He had chosen to die fighting in the place that held meaning to him, the place where he had promised to remember someone's name in the darkness. The Imperium called it heroism. I called it the only form of rebellion available to a man who had already lost everything that mattered. His personal effects were processed through Storage Bay 7 3 days after his cremation. I conducted the inventory personally, though regulations did not require Grade 3 personnel to handle such tasks. I opened Locker 119 expecting to find the usual contents: identification tags, letters, small possessions deemed non-heretical. Inside was a bundle wrapped in camouflage netting. I unwrapped it with hands that shook despite my efforts at professional composure. The bundle contained a piece of shrapnel, sanded smooth and polished to a dull shine. The same piece I had found in Merrick's locker nearly a year earlier. Cross must have retrieved it at some point, must have kept it hidden throughout all the months of carrying forward, living with the loss, accepting the lie. There was no data slate this time. No written confession or private promise. Just the shrapnel, anonymous and unremarkable to anyone who did not know its history. I held it in my palm and felt the weight of 2 lives condensed into a piece of metal debris. 2 soldiers who had loved each other in a galaxy that forbade that love. 2 men who had tried to hold on to connection in a system designed to make connection impossible. 2 deaths that looked like acceptable losses in a spreadsheet, but felt like genocide when you knew their names. I should have filed the shrapnel for disposal, should have processed Locker 119 according to standard protocol, logged its contents, forwarded everything to the incinerator along with the other mundane debris of military service. Instead, I wrapped the shrapnel back in its netting and placed it in my own footlocker, beneath my spare uniform and beside the commendation certificate I had once read before sleep. I became a thief of memory, stealing from the dead what the Imperium would have erased. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my bunk in the Grade 3 barracks, listening to the familiar sounds of the firebase at rest, the distant thump of artillery from the front lines, muffled to rhythmic percussion by distance and concrete walls, the hum of ventilation systems recycling stale air, the occasional clank of servo skulls patrolling the corridors. All of it normal, all of it routine, all of it part of the endless machine that ground human lives into statistical outcomes. I thought about my 9 years of service. 9 years of perfect ledgers and flawless documentation. 9 years of believing that accuracy in record-keeping served a holy purpose, that my spreadsheets captured truth and truth served the emperor. I had been proud of my work. I had recited the logistician's creed every morning with genuine faith, believing that by recording I honored, that by verifying I protected, that by accounting I contributed to something larger than myself. But what had I actually accomplished? I had enabled the commissariat to hunt soldiers whose only crime was caring about each other. I had maintained the system that made love into heresy, and devotion into grounds for execution. I had processed Merrick's corrected casualty report without question, had logged Cross's death without acknowledging its real meaning, had turned human tragedies into neat columns of numbers that made commanders comfortable and quotas satisfied. My perfect records were not neutral documentation of reality. They were active tools of oppression, weapons used to identify and eliminate anything that made soldiers more than replaceable components in a vast military machine. The realization did not arrive as sudden revelation but as slow, terrible comprehension. I had always known, on some level. Every time I noticed a pattern and chose not to report it. Every time I read a corrected casualty report and accepted the sanitized narrative. Every time I processed a transfer order that separated names appearing too frequently together. I had known and I had chosen complicity because complicity was easier than confrontation. Because my faith in the system made its cruelties feel necessary. Because questioning the Imperium meant questioning the foundation of everything I believed about purpose and meaning and service. But I could not maintain that faith anymore. The shrapnel in my footlocker was evidence I could not rationalize away. Merrick and Cross had existed. They had loved each other in whatever way soldiers in the Astra Militarum could love, had forged a bond that made them more human even as it made them more vulnerable. The Imperium had identified that bond as weakness and eliminated it with the same cold efficiency it applied to military logistics. And I had helped. I had maintained the records that made their elimination possible. I had processed their deaths as though they were nothing more than inventory shrinkage, acceptable losses in the endless calculation of war. The weight of that complicity felt crushing. I wanted to pray, wanted to recite the familiar words that had organized my thoughts for 9 years, but the logistician's creed felt hollow now. Let no soul pass unmeasured. But measuring souls meant reducing them to numbers. And numbers could hide everything that made them worth measuring in the first place. Let no death occur unlogged. But logging deaths without acknowledging their meaning made me complicit in murder dressed as duty. I rose from my bunk and walked through the empty archive bay, my breath misting in the 14-degree air, servo skulls tracking my movement with dispassionate red optics. My workstation glowed softly in the darkness, cogitator humming its patient rhythm. I accessed the personnel files one final time and began reviewing records with new eyes, seeing patterns I had trained myself to ignore. Not just romantic bonds but friendships, mentorships, any connection between soldiers that suggested they valued each other as individuals rather than components. The files were full of them. Everywhere I looked I found evidence of humans, refusing to be mere numbers, reaching across the void the Imperium created to touch each other, to matter to each other, to become something more than interchangeable. And everywhere I looked I found the commissariat's corrections, separations, reassignments, disciplinary actions, executions. The system was not failing to prevent these bonds. It was succeeding at identifying and destroying them. Every corrected casualty report was a small genocide, erasing not just lives, but the evidence that those lives had been connected to others in ways that gave them meaning beyond their military function. I found myself crying without realizing when the tears had started. Not loud sobs but silent leaking, hot moisture on my cheeks in the cold archive air. I was crying for Merrick and Cross, for the 37 other pairs I had documented before deleting my shadow ledger, for the hundreds more I suspected existed in regiments across the sector, for all the soldiers who dared to love in a galaxy that punished love as efficiently as it punished heresy. And I was crying for myself, for the person I had been 3 months ago, believing her perfect spreadsheets served something holy, For the faith I had lost, the certainty that had organized my existence and given my work meaning. For the complicity I could never undo, the deaths I had helped process, the erasures I had enabled. I had become a witness to genocide so subtle it did not even register as crime. I had maintained the ledgers that documented humanity being systematically crushed out of the Imperial Guard. And I had done it with pride in my precision. The choice came slowly, without drama or sudden decision. I simply knew with quiet clarity that I could not continue, could not return to my workstation tomorrow morning and recite the logistician's creed with sincerity, could not process another corrected casualty report knowing what those corrections really meant, could not maintain the illusion that my work was neutral documentation rather than active weapon. The system required my compliance to function efficiently, and I would no longer provide it. The practical options were limited. I could not simply leave. Desertion from Imperial service meant execution, not just for me but potentially for my family on distant Verdun Prime, my parents and younger brother who had been so proud when I earned my Munitorum commission. I could request transfer, but that would only move me to another archive bay, another regiment, where I would process different names, but participate in the same system. I could report what I had discovered to higher authorities, but the authorities already knew. Commissar Hendrik had made that clear. The corrections were not corruption to be exposed but policy to be maintained. I could do what Merrick had done. Refuse compliance, face execution, die knowing I had chosen conscience over survival. The thought held a certain appeal, a cleanness to it. But my death would change nothing. The system would continue without me. Some other logistician would take position 7 in the archive bay, would process the same casualty reports, would maintain the same perfect records. My death would be another number in another spreadsheet, quickly processed and filed away. The only meaningful resistance was documentation. Not the official records I had maintained so perfectly, but the truth those records concealed. If I could not stop the system, I could at least witness what it was doing. I could create testimony that might outlive the Imperium's sanitized narratives, that might someday allow future readers to understand the cost of the galaxy we had built. I began writing that night, recording everything I had discovered over the past 9 months. Not in official documentation but in raw narrative, naming names, describing patterns, explaining how the system identified and eliminated connection between soldiers. I documented Merrick and Cross in detail, transcribing the 7 lines from Merrick's data slate, describing how Cross had died at position Sigma 7 months after his companion's execution. I documented the 37 other probable cases I had tracked, giving names to the correlations I had identified before Commissar Hendrik's warning forced me to delete my shadow ledger. I wrote about the bureaucratic mechanics of erasure, about corrected casualty reports and predated execution warrants and transfer orders that separated soldiers whose requisition patterns showed too much synchronization. I wrote about the philosophical justification I had pieced together from Hendrik's statements and my own analysis, about how attachment compromised tactical flexibility and made soldiers less reliable as interchangeable components. I wrote about understanding the system's logic while rejecting its moral foundation, about acknowledging that personal bonds created vulnerability, while refusing to accept that vulnerability justified elimination. The writing took me 4 nights of work after my duty hours ended, composing in careful longhand on spare parchment I requisitioned from archive supplies. I could not use the cogitator for this testimony. Data stored electronically could be found, traced, deleted by authorities seeking to suppress evidence. Physical documentation was harder to control, could be hidden and moved and copied in ways that digital files could not. I wrote until my hand cramped, until my eyes burned from the archive bay's dim lighting, until I had recorded everything I knew about the Imperium's quiet war against human connection within the Astra Militarum. When I finished, I had 17 pages of dense text, small handwriting cramped to fit maximum information into minimum space. I read through it once, checking for accuracy, ensuring every name was spelled correctly and every correlation properly described. Then I sealed the pages inside an empty munitions canister I had salvaged from disposal inventory, a waterproof cylinder designed to protect explosive charges from environmental damage. The canister would protect the parchment from moisture, fire, decay. I marked it with a code that would mean nothing to anyone who found it without context, but that might signal to someone looking carefully that the contents were significant. I could not keep the testimony with me. Commissar Hendrik had made clear that my activities were monitored, my discretion tested. If I was discovered with documentation explicitly detailing the commissariat's systematic elimination of soldiers suspected of personal attachment, execution would be immediate and my testimony would be destroyed. The pages had to be hidden outside the base, somewhere they might survive even if I did not. The opportunity came during a routine supply run to the regimental depot 5 kilometers east of Firebase Tertius. I accompanied the transport convoy as part of my logistics duties, verifying delivery manifests and confirming proper accounting of transferred materials. The convoy route passed through a section of ruins, remnants of the hive city that had occupied this region before the Orc invasion reduced it to shattered concrete and twisted metal. The ruins stretched for kilometers in every direction, a wasteland of collapsed structures and debris fields too extensive to fully clear. I buried the canister in the ruins during a routine stop, digging a shallow hole beneath a section of collapsed wall that had probably been part of an administratum building before the war. The location was marked by 3 specific features: a shattered Aquila mosaic still partially visible in the concrete rubble, a support pillar bent at precisely 45 degrees, and a pile of twisted rebar arranged in a rough triangle. Anyone who knew what to look for could find the canister. Anyone who found it by accident might simply discard it as military debris. But the testimony would survive, would exist somewhere outside the official records, would bear witness to truths the Imperium preferred to keep hidden. I returned to Firebase Tertius and resumed my duties as though nothing had changed. Processed requisition forms, verified casualty reports, maintained the perfect spreadsheets that had once given my life meaning. The work felt mechanical now, empty of purpose beyond providing cover for what I had already done. I was no longer serving the Imperium. I was simply surviving within it while waiting for the inevitable moment when my compliance would no longer protect me. That moment arrived 3 weeks after I buried the testimony. Commissar Hendrik appeared at my workstation during the morning processing period, his augmetic eye fixed on my terminal screen with what might have been suspicion or might have been routine inspection. He did not speak immediately, simply stood at my shoulder while I processed a batch of equipment requisitions, his presence a weight that made concentration nearly impossible. Finally, he spoke. "You have been requisitioning archive supplies at elevated rates over the past month. Parchment usage up 47% compared to your typical consumption patterns. Can you explain this discrepancy?" The question was not accusation yet, but it was close. I kept my voice steady. "I have been implementing new filing protocols to improve physical backup systems, sir. Digital cogitator storage can fail. Physical documentation provides redundancy. Show me these new filing protocols." I gestured to a section of storage lockers where I had indeed been creating additional physical backups of routine documentation, legitimate work I had undertaken partly to provide cover for my testimony writing, and partly because it was actually useful. Hendrik reviewed the files carefully, his augmetic eye scanning pages while his organic eye watched my face. The inspection lasted 12 minutes. "These protocols are acceptable," he said finally. "However, your parchment requisitions will return to standard levels effective immediately. Any further deviations will require written justification filed with the commissariat before approval." "Understood, sir." He departed without further comment, but the message was clear. I was being watched more carefully now. The grace period Hendrik had offered me months ago was narrowing. My next deviation from perfect compliance would not be tolerated. I continued my duties for 6 more weeks, maintaining flawless documentation, avoiding any action that might draw attention, but I knew I was living on borrowed time. Hendrik suspected something even if he could not prove it. Eventually he would find justification for investigation, would search my quarters and workstation, would discover something that warranted disciplinary action. The commissariat did not need evidence to execute. It only needed suspicion and authority. The decision came during a routine evening in the 9th week after burying my testimony. I was alone in my barracks quarters, lying on my bunk and staring at the corrugated metal ceiling. Tomorrow I would return to the archive bay, would process another day of requisitions and casualty reports, would maintain the system that turned human beings into numbers. The day after that would be identical, and the day after that. An endless sequence of complicity stretching forward until age or combat or commissarial judgment ended it. I could not do it anymore. Could not pretend my perfect spreadsheets were neutral. Could not process another corrected casualty report knowing it documented erasure rather than recording death. Could not maintain faith in a system I now understood was designed to crush exactly the qualities that made us worth preserving. I opened my footlocker and removed the piece of shrapnel I had taken from Cross's personal effects. The metal was cool in my palm, smooth where he had sanded it, rough where explosive force had torn it from something larger. This small piece of debris was all that remained to prove Merrick and Cross had existed, had mattered to each other, had been more than inventory entries in a military database. I held it tightly enough that the rough edges bit into my palm. Then I composed a final data slate message, short and direct, addressed to Commissar Hendrik. The message contained a single sentence. I can no longer maintain records that document erasure as death. I sent the message. Then I placed Cross's shrapnel on my workstation in the archive bay, positioned it directly in the center of my terminal screen, and waited. Hendrik arrived within the hour. He read the message on my terminal, looked at the shrapnel, then looked at me with his cold gray eye and his red augmetic optic. His expression showed nothing, not anger, not disappointment, not surprise, just the flat professional assessment of a man evaluating a situation requiring resolution. "This is confession of doctrinal deviance," he said quietly. "Questioning the righteousness of imperial record-keeping constitutes heresy against the administratum's holy function. You understand the penalty?" "Yes, sir. You will be executed tomorrow at dawn." Firing squad. Standard protocol for Munitorum personnel found guilty of faith crimes. Your personal effects will be seized and reviewed for additional evidence of heretical thought. Your family will be notified of your death with no details beyond combat casualty. Is there anything you wish to say before I file the formal charges? I looked at the shrapnel on my terminal screen, thought about Merrick writing 7 lines of devotion on a cheap data slate, knowing that devotion would kill him. Thought about Cross dying at position Sigma 7 because dying there meant something, even if the meaning was known only to himself. Thought about 37 other pairs of soldiers loving each other in a galaxy that called their love weakness. I was wrong, I said. For 9 years I believed my perfect records served truth, but truth that erases humanity is not truth. It is just another form of murder. Hendrik nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he already knew. You are not wrong about the system's function, only about whether that function is necessary. Someone must maintain these records, Voss. Someone must process the corrections and accept the justifications and keep the machine running. Better it be someone who understands the cost than someone who does not. I cannot be that person anymore. I know. His augmetic eye whirred through some calibration sequence. I have been doing this for 93 years, Voss. Do you think I do not question it? Do you think I have not lain awake wondering if the bonds I destroy might be exactly what makes the Imperium worth preserving? But someone must be willing to make the impossible choice. Someone must be willing to choose survival over mercy, order over compassion. I do not know if I am right. I have never known. But the alternative is allowing the Astra Militarum to fracture into millions of small loyalties that cannot be coordinated or controlled. And that fragmentation means extinction. He paused, and something flickered across his face, some ghost of uncertainty or regret. Then the mask returned. You will die tomorrow having chosen conscience over survival. That is noble in its way, but your death changes nothing. The system will continue. Someone else will take your position in the archive bay. The records will be maintained. The corrections will be processed. The bonds will be identified and eliminated. Your testimony, wherever you have hidden it, will eventually be found and destroyed. This is the weight of the galaxy we inhabit. There are no good choices, only different forms of complicity. Then I choose the complicity of refusal, I said. Hendrik turned to leave, then stopped at the archive bay entrance. He did not look back at me when he spoke. Private Merrick's final words before execution were your name Voss. He said you had seen their requisition patterns, had noticed the correlations, but had chosen not to report them. He thanked you for that mercy with his last breath. Sergeant Cross never knew. He died believing you had been ignorant of what you were documenting. I thought you should know that your small act of compassion mattered to at least one person, even if it changed nothing. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the archive bay with Cross's shrapnel, and my perfect spreadsheets, and the certain knowledge that tomorrow at dawn I would die for choosing to be human in a system that required inhumanity. I am dead now. I have been dead for 16 hours by the time you read this, my body cremated and my name transferred from active roster to casualty archive. The official record will list my cause of death as heresy against the administratum's holy function. Charges substantiated by confession of doctrinal deviance. The commissariat will file my execution as justified and necessary. The 81st Cadian will requisition a replacement logistician. The machine will continue running as though I had never existed, but this testimony survives. 17 pages sealed in a munitions canister, buried in ruins beneath a shattered Aquila and a bent support pillar. 17 pages documenting what the Imperium prefers to hide. That soldiers in the Astra Militarum dare to love each other, despite knowing that love means death. That the system hunts these bonds not because they are weakness but because they are strength of the wrong kind. Loyalty that runs horizontal between individuals rather than vertical toward the Emperor. That every corrected casualty report conceals a small genocide, erasing not just lives but evidence that those lives mattered to someone beyond their military function. I do not know if anyone will find this testimony. I do not know if it will survive longer than a few years before the ruins are cleared or the parchment decays, or the commissariat search patterns sweep wide enough to discover it. But I wrote it anyway because witnessing was the only resistance available to me. Because Merrick and Cross deserved to have someone remember their names, remember that they existed, remember that their love was real even if the Imperium declared it heretical. If you are reading this, you have found evidence the administratum cannot erase through corrections, and the commissariat cannot eliminate through execution. You have found proof that somewhere in the vast military machine of the Astra Militarum, two soldiers chose each other over the Emperor, and that choice made them more human even as it made them more doomed. You have found my testimony to the simple, terrible truth that in a galaxy demanding you be a number, remembering someone's name becomes the final quiet heresy. I was Alara Voss. I served as Grade 3 Munitorum Logistician, serial designation 7743 Theta Voss, for 9 years. I maintained perfect records until I understood what those records really documented. I chose to stop. I chose to die as myself rather than continue as the system's accomplice. I do not know if this was the right choice. I only know it was the only choice I could still live with. Remember that soldiers are more than numbers in spreadsheets. Remember that love in the Astra Militarum is not weakness but the last desperate assertion of humanity in a galaxy designed to crush it. Remember Cade Merrick and Rylan Cross, who died for the crime of mattering to each other. Remember the 37 other pairs whose names I documented before my shadow ledger was deleted. Remember all the soldiers across all the regiments who choose connection despite knowing the cost. And if you can be the witness I could only be in death. Bear testimony to what the Imperium tries to hide, not to destroy the system, for I am not knave enough to believe testimony can topple empires, but to preserve the memory that we were human once, before the machinery of war ground that humanity into acceptable losses and statistical casualties. The Emperor protects, the priests tell us. But who protects us from the Emperor's necessity? Who remembers the souls crushed beneath the weight of survival? Who witnesses the quiet genocides committed in the name of order? I did. I bore witness. And now you do too. That is my testimony. That is all I have to offer. A handful of names preserved against the Imperium's forgetting. A record of love existing despite prohibition. Proof that in the archive bay's 14-degree air, surrounded by servo skulls and perfect spreadsheets, one logistician chose to stop being complicit. I am dead now. But I died remembering their names. I died knowing that mattered, even if only to me. I died human. That will have to be enough.